Hello everyone, welcome back to another LeetCode problem. We're doing question 152, maximum product of a subarray, and this is a medium rated problem. Now when I first saw this, I thought it would be similar to the maximum sum of a subarray, but it is solved very differently. Now it reads, given an integer array nums, find a subarray that has the largest product and return the product. The test cases are generated so that the answer will fit in a 32-bit integer. Now, what does this read? Well, this is the practice test case that I'll be using to solve this problem. And all it's saying is we want to return the maximum product of a subarray. Now, what's a subarray? It's an array within an array. Now we have this, it's a 1. We have this, it's a -1. We have this subarray. Well, we're getting the products, we're multiplying them. We have this, we have this, we have this, but we also have this and this and this. Like there are a lot of combinations, but the answer here would end up being it should be -2. It should be this array here, -2 times -5 times 3 times 2, which ends up being 60. Now, why is this different from the sum? The sum, right? The maximum sum of a subarray, and that's because we deal with negatives and zeros differently now. A 0 completely kills the product because anything times a 0 is equal to 0. But if for the maximum sum, anything plus a 0 is still equal to something, right? So that's why this is different. And another reason is because of the negatives. Now, if we had a maximum sum of an array and we had a negative on the end, then automatically we take the ends away and we only take the middle, right? Because these can only lower the sum. But now we have different cases. If we have two negatives, they actually increase the product because a negative times a negative is a positive. Okay, now how do we solve this? Now, I did start it off the same way that I would have solved the maximum sum of a subarray. Now, if you guys want to know what I'm talking about, I would highly suggest you guys check out the that question first. I did a video on it earlier. Now, okay, so the way I would solve this is obviously we need to create some max sum variable, or actually it would be max product, and that's just going to keep track of just the maximum number that we're going to have. And we're going to start it off at -infinity, because then any number, we don't want its initial value to have any meaning, and that way any number that we get will be greater than this number. And now we're going to need some counter, and we actually need two counters, C2 and C1. We're going to start them at 1 because a product multiplying something by 1 has no effect. And we're just going to iterate through every single value. Now, obviously, the most logical step is to multiply the num by our counters. So this 1 would be multiplied by 1 and 1. And now you'll see why we have two different counters, but their values would end up being 1 and 1. Okay, and from there we would actually check the value if it's greater than our current max product, and since it is, we store 1. Okay, simple enough. Now we move on to the next one. We do the same exact thing, multiply them, and they both become 0. And is 0 greater than 1? No. Now our very first case is if C1 is equal to 0 or C2 is equal to 0, well, that's the end of that subarray, because automatically we know that we can't have a 0 in the middle of it, right? Unless, of course, our array was completely filled with negative numbers, which, if that was the case, we still want to take it out, because that 0 would be stored here if that was the case. So from there, if these two are 0, then we want to reset them back to 1s for both cases. Not to 1. Okay, so then they become 1. And this isn't a list or anything. I'm just showing, like, updating what values they are, basically. Okay, now we're at -1. And we multiply both -1 and -1. Now we check, is 1 greater than -1? Yes, so we keep it. Now here is why we have two different counters. Now if they are both negative, what we actually want to do is change C2 back to a 1, because right now we don't know that if keeping this negative will help or not help this array, because if this -2 didn't exist, for example, well, this -1, oh, we might see it turns it negative, so we don't want it, right? So we want 2 times 3, which is 6. Now we have a -5. The thing is, 2 times 3 times -5 is -30. -30 is a very small number, but if we were to have kept this -1, it would have been a +30, right? So that's why, so now how this works is C1, well, C2 became 1. Well, C1, we're basically saying is taking in this interval here, but C2 is going from here because it's 1 now, and when it gets multiplied by 2, it will only be 2, it won't be -2. And then from there, remember, when we're checking the max product, we're checking between both of these values and the max product. So both cases will be taken into account. So let's see how that works. Well, we have our values of -1 and 1. Now let's move on to the next number, 2. We do the exact same thing, multiply it. And we compare with our max product. Now the max between all those three numbers is 2. Now we keep going to 3, and that number becomes -6 and 6. And the biggest number is 6. Keep going to -5. Now see, if we were to have kept one counter, oh, actually that doesn't prove anything yet. Yeah, okay, if we were to have just kept a +1, right, well, this becomes a -30, and -30 is less than 6, so we can't do that. But because we also kept a -1, we have a +30. So this becomes a 30. And now here, again, if we would have only kept one counter, then this would have become a -60. And we wouldn't be able to use -60, but this is now a +60. So our new max is 60. And that becomes our final answer. Now this algorithm ends up having a time complexity of O to the n and has constant memory. The reason why it's O to the n is because it's just one for loop, and we're doing a bunch of O to the 1 operations. And that's all it is. It's a pretty simple question. It's not too bad. Now let's head over to LeetCode and see if we can find the solution. Okay, now that we are here, let's start by setting up our maximum product. Let's just call it prod. And we're going to use the float operator, and you just type in -infinity, and this value will always be the smallest possible number. And we're going to create our two counters, C1 and C2. We're going to start them at 1. Again, because 1 doesn't affect any products. For num and nums, so this iterates through the list of numbers, and num just holds whatever number we're at. Well, we're just going to multiply C1 and C2 by that number. Now, we want to check if, are they both negative? If C1 is less than 0 and C2 is less than 0. Well, remember then we want to reset C2 to 1, and we want to keep the original value of C1, just in case that number turns back to positive again. Now, if we want to have one final check, which is if C1 is equal to 0. And you can write if C2 is or C2 is equal to 0, but checking one of them is enough because we're always multiplying both numbers by the same number. And the only way to get 0 is if a 0 pops up in our list. So when C1 is 0, C2 will always be 0 as well. So here we can update them both back to 1s. That's it. It's a very simple code, and we just return the max prod. Well, actually, we are missing one line, one very important line, and that is to actually update that max prod. We spelled it wrong. Max prod. And here is how this works. We just go max prod, and we want to make it equal to the maximum value between whatever max prod originally was, and we want to check both C1 and C2 because there are cases where one of them is negative and the other is positive. And from here, we could just submit our solution and see if it's correct. There you go. It does very well in time. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in another video.